Welcome back to Music Kingdom. I'm taking a small break from the song reviews I usually do on this channel, even though I love doing them, and instead I'm going to do something that I've kind of always wanted to do with the channel, which would be album reviews. And so for my very first one, I thought I would properly begin my journey of the catalog by a specific band in particular. In this video, I will be reviewing the debut album released in 1993 titled Undertow by Tool. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, my name is Francis. If you are a fellow nerd for music such as myself, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you'd like to support the work I put into these videos, you'll find various links in the description below. Okay, so for what it's worth, I have heard a number of Tool songs before, and I have reviewed a few of them on this channel. However, I have never properly and chronologically explored the catalog of Tool, which is why I started with Undertow. Now, to be honest, I did have the idea of starting with Fear Inoculum, their most recent album. And my logic was, when I did my research on Fear Inoculum, because that's what this video was going to be, I found that a lot of what was being said about it, a lot of the opinions were very slanted, were very biased, constantly comparing it to previous albums by Tool, holding them to the standard of their previous work, which to some extent, in my opinion, is fair, but on the other hand, to a certain extent as well, it's also a bit unfair, not really giving the album for what it is a fair chance when assessing it or critiquing it. So my idea was to listen to it with fresh, virgin ears, having nothing legitimate to really compare it to. However, evidently, I did land on Undertow, because ultimately, subjectively or personally speaking, when I am rabbit holing, when I am nosediving into the catalog of an artist or a band, one of my favorite things about that journey is the growth and evolution of the artist or band over all of the years they made music. And while I admittedly know very little about Tool, I have heard that they've had quite the evolution over several years when they created their music. And so there you have it. We're starting with Undertow, and we're doing it the right way. Alright, now let's talk about the album itself. And before I eventually get to my initial impressions, my favorite songs, my least favorite songs, overall thoughts about whatever it might be, whether it be composition, production, vocals, songwriting, originality, etc., in my opinion, it is equally important and relevant to paint the picture, set the scene, historically and contextually speaking, of the landscape of the music industry when this album came out in 1993. I realize I am in my late 20s, which means this album was slightly before my time, so I'm not going to pretend that I was around back then. But even still, I make it a point to try and educate myself to the best of my ability on the history of music, so I'll give it my best shot. This is a time in the United States coming off the heels of the 1980s, which meant the Reagan administration, Christianity, conservatism, since the 70s in many ways were such a mess, and it's that whole ripple effect. So it was a time that was very anti-drugs. There was a time of the satanic panic, which was a very legitimate thing. You had E.T., you had Back to the Future, you had Thriller, you had the tail end of Star Wars. And so by the dawn of the 90s, there was this shift, which in my opinion is kind of just a natural progression coming out of a certain type of decade, entering a new one, in which that squeaky clean aesthetic was going away. The social climate was feeling a bit more liberal, there was more rebellion, which also naturally has its own trickle effect on the music business. Hip-hop, for example, was absolutely blossoming, and hip-hop back then was very socially conscious. They would talk about government, racism, politics, power to the people, fuck the system, so on and so forth. That's just a small example of what was becoming mainstream. Artists and bands who had existed before were also maturing. Guns N' Roses at this point in history were absolutely huge, and they had matured from a song like Welcome to the Jungle to then Civil War and November Rain. Michael Jackson, who was still the biggest and most famous artist on the planet, even he realized the days of Thriller or The Way You Make Me Feel were gone, and he would release a song in 1991 titled Give In To Me, which was a hard rock song featuring Slash from Guns N' Roses on the guitar. And even Michael's vocal delivery in that song, for example, was much harder. It had a bit of scratch. But in addition to all of that, there was a new genre basically on the rise in a mainstream way, perhaps even bigger than a musical genre because it trickled into fashion as well, and that would be the word grunge. Yes, bands like Iron Maiden or Metallica were still around, but a new style was emerging, and emerging strongly, such as Alice in Chains or Nirvana. And so with all of that said, it brings us to a point in 1993 where one of those new bands on the scene wasn't quite totally metal, wasn't quite totally grunge. They were more unique, they were more distinctive, somewhere between alternative and progressive metal. This band dropped their debut album, and that band, of course, would be Tool, which finally brings us to Undertow. So let's talk about it. I'll be giving it a score out of 10 towards the end of the video, but in case you're wanting to click off this video already, I'm just gonna come right out and say that overall, as an album, I thought it was good, not great. In my opinion, there were some truly great songs, and in my opinion, there were some not great songs on this album. What was fun for me though, when listening start to finish, is that in some ways, this album was not what I was expecting at all. And in other ways, it was what I was expecting. As mentioned, I have heard a small number of Tool songs, but granted, most of those Tool songs were in the 2000s, and they were a very different brand of Tool. For example, let's take the song Lateralis. In that song, while it is emotional, while it is serious, while it is heavy, the songwriting is simultaneously encouraging, uplifting, beautiful, with themes of mysticism and metaphysics and philosophy. And when I reviewed it, hearing it for the first time, it actually brought me to tears. So regarding what I was or was not expecting with the album Undertow, I had songs like that in mind. But on the other hand, of course, I was aware of the aforementioned context of it being in the early 90s and it being a debut album. So while I was half expecting it to kind of sound like the times, my initial impression of the album upon hearing it was that of absolute shock. This is an album that start to finish, in my opinion, felt so dark. It had such strong themes of alienation and rebellion, relentless and refreshing vulgarity, and an overwhelming feeling throughout the entire album of this pent up, bottled up anger and angst. And while I wouldn't call this album grunge by any means, because it's not a grunge album, it definitely felt much more than I was expecting like that grunge era of music, and was such a far cry from the more evolved material that Tool would eventually create, which, for the record, I most certainly do not hold against the album in any way when reviewing it. I was just surprised. Now, what did not surprise me, but was still very welcome, is that even though this was a debut album and they were much younger, it still felt top to bottom like Tool. So much of their creativity and technical expertise was blatantly evident. Certain skills and abilities that I'm sure they did hone over time were just already there, which is what really makes the album all the more impressive for me, at least from a standpoint of originality. As mentioned, yes, Iron Maiden was around, yes, Metallica was around, Nirvana was on the rise, Alice in Chains, so on and so forth. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume not many bands were doing or could do what Tool was already doing out of the gates. I can only imagine how influential an album like this was at the time of its release. I'm not going to entirely credit Tool for the creation of future subgenres such as nu metal or pop punk, nor is this album either of those two genres, but I can only imagine the whoa factor and how it would naturally push the evolution of the gigantic umbrella of metal along for years to come. Now, regarding the more technical or musical aspects of the album, the two things that stood out the most to me would be the production and the songwriting. Production-wise, for me at least, it felt a bit more muddy, it felt a bit murky, and you'll have to bear with this being my first proper album review. I'm sure as I do more over time, I'll become more eloquent and articulate with my assessments. But yes, the production felt to me a bit more raw, as opposed to perhaps later productions by Tool which felt more clean and felt more crisp. Neither style necessarily being better or worse than the other, but I just thought it was interesting and refreshing. Now, with regards to the songwriting, which also stood out to me, as mentioned, it felt just so dark and enraged. I had this image in my head of perhaps later Tool being a strong, beautiful butterfly spreading its wings, whereas the songwriting with the album Undertow felt like that butterfly was still in its cocoon, just pent up and furious. And I'll take the cocoon example just a bit further with regards to the album itself as well. But in this case, not with the songwriting, instead the band as a whole. It felt very formative. Obviously, despite it being their debut, as mentioned, it still felt very Tool with the time signatures and the songwriting and the vocal styles and the guitar riffs, so on and so forth. But at the same time, like baby Tool, like they're still figuring things out at the earliest possible stages of their evolution, and that is in no way disrespect to their talents and abilities, especially at such a young age. But yeah, listening to this album, you feel like it is much more formative and that they are rightfully still figuring things out and themselves out. With regards to my overall initial impressions of the album, that is pretty much what I had to say. So now let's talk about some of my favorite tracks. To get the obvious and predictable out of the way, I do feel like the song Sober was, of course, a legitimate standout. And yes, I realize how generic and unoriginal that sounds. Personally speaking, I loved the melody. I thought it was catchy yet creative at the same time. I thought the writing was very intentional and inspired. And to some extent, the song Sober to me felt like the earliest possible days or signs of legitimate introspection, lyrically speaking. Obviously not quite as evolved as later work by Tool, but you can tell that the seeds were there. In addition to that, it had great vocal moments as well, perhaps not throughout the entirety of the song, but certain parts you're like, Jesus Christ. I also really loved how the song slows down to an extent around the 3-minute and 15-second mark. And then towards the end, the production gets, in my opinion, even more creative than it already was, with an absolutely bitchin' outro that I figure anybody in 1993 who heard that had their minds blown. The next standout for me was actually the very next track, titled Bottom. Of all the songs on the album, this one to me felt perhaps the most creatively composed or structured. Is it the type of song that you're gonna hop in your car and just throw on? Probably not, but again, that's not the point. I thought the production in this song in particular was also just very clever, as if they'd been doing this for years and years and years. I thought the spoken word bit later on in the song was incredibly unique. I can't imagine how uncommon that is in that genre of music. And then with a little over a minute remaining in the song, you get this insane vocal performance. Perhaps the best on the entire album, or at least thus far along the way. Now, ultimately, my top favorite song on the entire album, and the song that I personally felt was the best song, would be the title track, Undertow. In my opinion, of all the songs on this album, it had the best writing. It also was a bit foreshadowing in the sense that this also had certain vibes of metaphysics, at least the way I interpreted it, but of course something that would become much more evident in their later work. I also loved all of the different switch-ups and transitions, compositionally speaking, in this song. I believe around 55 seconds it shifts, and then around 1minute and 20 seconds it shifts back, and then probably around 1minute and 40 seconds it goes back again to the original groove. That whole segment, at least subjectively speaking, blew me away. All in addition to very welcome and fun time signatures, just remarkable drumming throughout, and of course, once again, a superb outro. Now, to put an end to my kindness and flattery, let's talk about the shortcomings on the album. In my opinion, the absolute worst song, bar none, on this entire album is its opening track titled Intolerance. And boy, my tolerance for this song was low. In defense of it, I do want to applaud its creative production. I thought the various transitions were very sharp and well executed. The outro for me as well was a little bit redeeming, but otherwise, Christ. I know we all love tempo changes and various time signatures and things like that, which you would think is a redeeming quality of this song, but I hate to break it to you, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but sometimes, even though you have distinctive, unique, different, weird, fun time signatures and things like that, it doesn't automatically make a song good. Sometimes if it backfires bad enough, it can be like putting lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig. On top of that, while the lyrics did not feel entirely aimless, in my opinion, they got redundant very quickly. Now, ultimately, do I think this is a genuinely bad song? No, I do not. It's too talented and intricate to be a bad song. But is it the worst of the bunch? In my opinion, hell yes. I'd say it's fine. Now, the other unfortunate standout for me would be the second to last track, titled Flood. This is a near 8-minute track that didn't at least lyrically begin until about 4.5 minutes in. And look, I am all for instrumental introductions. I am all for abstract composition. I love creativity and musicianship. That is why I have this channel. But damn it, the first 4.5 minutes of this song, great as Tool is, were dull, in my opinion at least. Now granted, after that 4.5 minute mark, it does get better. I think the writing was solid enough. I think the vocals were very strong. I even enjoyed the melodies, drumming top tier as always. But by the time it ended, honestly, I felt like I was never gonna get that 7 minutes and 48 seconds in my life back. Now, all in all, those were really the only 2 tracks on the entire album that I was unhappy with. I will say between the best songs and the worst songs, I did enjoy the rest of the album, but perhaps in a lukewarm type of way. I thought Prison Sex was good, disturbing, but fun, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. The band's performance in that song as well was insanely tight, by the way. I also enjoyed the song titled Crawl Away as well. I thought it was one of, if not the best intros of any song on the album, but the writing in that song felt bland, uninspired. It gets pretty compositionally creative about 3 minutes and 50 seconds into it. An absolutely insane segment, but honestly, no disrespect to the vocals, but I might have preferred an instrumental version of that song. Swamp Song was also an alright song for me, but in my opinion, perhaps a little lackluster. I thought as far as everything else on this album goes, this song actually felt the most generic. It felt the least like Tool. There was an exquisite bridge around 2 minutes and 45 seconds into the track, and a big improvement on the composition in the overall second half of the song, but still, by the end, for the aforementioned reasons, now, the track 4 Degrees was a bit interesting. I think stylistically speaking, it was perhaps the most foreshadowing of their later work. I also can appreciate that it was another introspective song in terms of its songwriting. Nice chord progressions and things like that as well, but overall it felt pretty simple, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with a simple song, but stacked against the rest of this album, I didn't feel like it's a song I wanted to necessarily go back and revisit and relive. Lastly, we have the closing track on the album, which is very, very unique, titled Disgustipated. I think at least in the beginning it had perhaps the most unique and imaginative production. I love the sermon that was given. I like the symbolism of the lamb sounds as well. But then of course there is a hilariously long segment of silence is what we'll call it. For 7 minutes. 30 seconds would have felt long. 2 minutes would have felt long. 5 minutes would have felt like an eternity. By 7 minutes I was thinking about what I wanted to cook for dinner. Now to be clear, I do not want to insult artistry. I do not want to insult abstract compositions. I do not want to insult creativity. It is any artist's right to make anything the way they want and leave it open for interpretation. That is the point of art in whichever form it takes. I 100% acknowledge that, but you didn't have to do it. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the spoken word at the end of the song, albeit very welcome and well written, in my opinion, was not enough to save the song. I'm sure it's possible that there is some deeper meaning to the song and why it was composed that way. I could probably Google the song and find the exact reason as quoted by members of the band. I'm just speaking strictly for the experience of the listener. Those were my thoughts. All in all, in conclusion, and back to flattery, in my opinion, ultimately, this is a good album. If we're speaking historically, if we're speaking contextually, I would say it is a great album. So I'm definitely wanting to be mindful and weigh both of those things. Does it have its fair share of duds? Yes, but as mentioned, are those duds genuinely bad or terrible songs? Certainly not. And in addition to that, does it have its fair share of gems? Most certainly. And so I will say, top to bottom, it is well balanced. While it does feel like a formative record because it is, it's literally a debut album, and while it does feel like it's Tool in their cocoon phase before becoming that metaphysical butterfly, even still, it has immensely strong vocals, brilliant compositions, especially for the time, an intricate yet creative yet murky sort of production style, talented guitar riffs, exquisite drumming, fresh and inspired songwriting overall, albeit imperfect, but still, and blatant originality, especially, again, highlighted by the fact that this is an album from 30 years ago. So with all of that said, weighing the performance of the band track after track, weighing the other aforementioned musical components, weighing the originality and creativity and artistry, and of course weighing the relevant historical context, if the greatest albums ever made in the history of the music industry by anybody of any genre would land a 9 or a 10, I'm going to give Tool's debut album Undertow a strong 7. Let me know in the comments whether or not you agree. Let me know in the comments what your most and least favorite tracks are. And of course, if you enjoyed the format of this video, let me know which album you'd like for me to review next. As mentioned, if you are a fellow nerd for music such as myself, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you'd like to support the work I put into these videos, you'll find various links in the description below. This has been another edition of Music Kingdom. Thank you so much for hanging with me, and I look forward to jamming with you in the next one.